have you here with us today. We're just finishing some technical details about going live streaming, and then we will start on.
We can start.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we're streaming.
Yes, great. Thank you, everyone. My name is Nikos Panagiotou. I am an associate professor at School of Journalism and Mass Media Communications, Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and also in charge of DCN Southeast Europe Hub in digital communication. This event, as you all know, it is the 18th one in the row, and we are really happy about it because we have started early enough, and it seems that we have managed to attract very interesting speakers as the one that we have the pleasure to have with us today. The event is organized from DCNC Hub, World Learning and Digital Communication Network, which is a network of people that are interested in, scholars that are interested in digital communication. The webinars and all this effort is being supported by State Department Office of Citizens Exchange, to whom we are very thankful for providing us the chance to widespread the discussion and the knowledge about very important topics. Lucas, the floor is yours. Peter, thank you very much for being with us here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, first of all, to everybody who's dedicated the time to attending today. Thank you to everybody who's both on the Zoom meeting and, of course, everybody who's joining the social media live streams. It's wonderful, enthusiastic audiences like you that make everything possible. Thank you. And thank you so much, Patrick, for giving up such a big part of your morning. I know it's 10 a.m. Eastern time. I know that I'm allergic against 10 a.m. commitments. I hope it's okay for you as well. And yeah, today we're going to be learning about some of Patrick's work at ICANN. And Patrick will, of course, introduce ICANN in a little more depth, but it's one of those incredible organizations that's responsible for some of the absolutely key infrastructure on the internet, namely the domain name system, or what means that essentially, if we type in an address like www.google.com, there's actually a complicated infrastructure and a big bunch of servers that make sure that we actually end up at a site and at a server that's delivering content from www.google.com. And ICANN is the institution that's managing this, as well as all of the domain name registrations. Now, of course, with domain names, with the DNS system, as it's called, there are lots and lots of interesting security issues and questions, which Patrick will talk to us today. So Patrick, thank you so much for being with us today. And the floor is yours, and I understand that you've got a presentation for us, yes?
Yes, thank you very much for having me to join your group today. Let's see, you've given me the rights to share back the screen. You can see this now? Everything looks good?
Yes, very good.
Great. So I'll start to talk a little bit about my role at ICANN and what the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers does. It's a technical coordination body. We're headquartered in Los Angeles, California, but we also have offices in Brussels and Istanbul, Singapore, Montevideo, Uruguay, and staff located throughout the world. My role is in our global stakeholder engagement team, and I've been at ICANN for 14 years. In my time at ICANN, I've done a variety of roles, including working with our contracted parties, with our registries. I also spent 4 years in our ICANN security team, and I continue to work closely with that team. And it's quite interesting now with all of the issues around dealing with criminal organizations that are trying to take advantage of people in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll talk a bit about what our Office of the CTO security teams have been doing in response to that, which should be quite interesting for those that are watching both the live stream and participating directly in the Zoom session. If at any time, Lucas, you see questions, stop me. But I do intend to start with giving, put a little bit of the background into what are internet identifiers and how that impacts with ICANN's role, because that sets the stage for talking about DNS security issues and some of the challenges that we're seeing. So if that looks good, I'll proceed along those lines.
Yeah, of course, that looks great. As I said to Patrick beforehand and to everybody now, I will also be monitoring the chat. So if you've got questions, you can, we can either call on you at some point, or you can raise your hand in Zoom, of course. There's a little feature in the participant setting, or just post it in the chat and I'll be keeping the questions. If you've got any questions about clarifications or haven't heard, you can write to me directly and I'm more than happy to answer it as well. So I will later on be putting together the questions from the chat and putting them to Patrick. Alternatively, if you'd like to ask it yourself, just message me as well. Thanks a lot.
Yep, great. Okay, so I'm going to start and give a bit of background into what is the domain name system, what are we talking about with unique identifiers, names and numbers in our daily work at ICANN. When we're talking about the internet, we're talking about a mesh of networks, and these operators agree to communicate together using a set of protocols. These networks use names or numbers to identify particular hosts or machines, and that allows information to transmit across jurisdictions and across different servers around the world. In ICANN, these are either names, numbers, or protocol parameters. Now, why is it very important for these names to be unique? Well, you can see at the top, these different numbers stand for Internet Protocol version 4 or Internet Protocol version 6. And you can see these numbers translate to different machines that are accessible on the internet. Now, Internet Protocol addresses are very easy for machines to use, but people can't remember these very well. And so the process of mapping these IP addresses to names is what we call name resolution. And that's just the process of translating these hexadecimal numbers, a very long IP version 4 or version 6 addresses, into names. And then people can use these names, typing them in their address bar or in a browser or on their phone, and to be able to connect to whatever they're looking for on the internet. Now, when we're talking about the domain name system, there isn't a single definition for what this is. But in this document that was developed through the Internet Engineering Task Force, there's a couple different ways that you can refer to the domain name system. It's either a commonly used naming scheme for different objects that are on the internet. It can be a distributed database, and it represents the names and the properties of those objects. It's the overall architecture of the system, and it provides a distributed way for it to respond to attacks. It also provides a distributed control, and it's the query and response protocol that is used for managing this structure. Now, the way this is set up is that it's an inverted tree structure. So at the top, we have the root, which ICANN coordinates the distribution of the names that are in the root. The next level down, we have what we call top level nodes or top level domains. And this could be everything from .gr for the country code for Greece, .com, .coffee, and internationalized domains, such as the example here is the internationalized country code name for Hong Kong. The next level down, you have, these are second level names, and this could be everything from google.com to the DCN Southeastern Europe domain. And that's what people commonly think of when they're accessing domains through the internet. Now, there are some rules for what's allowable in the domain name system. These domains have a maximum length. They can only be 63 characters. And emoji domains, which are quite popular in texting and applications or on WhatsApp, those are not allowed as top level labels or as in many registries aren't even allowed to enable these at the second level. Now, ICANN has, back in 2009, introduced a process that allowed for internationalization in top-level domains and at the second level. And we're now up to 61 of these internationalized country code domains for 42 countries and territories. India has the most, as they have the most official languages. So they have 22 in their official languages and scripts. But in Southeastern Europe, you probably are beginning to see some of these being used. Names such as .bel for Belarus, or .ukr for Ukraine, .srb for Serbia. And the European Union has two, .eu in Greek and in Bulgarian Cyrillic script. So we're seeing more of these names being used, and that's great for particularly for people in countries and territories where their language is not represented in Latin characters. Now they can represent their content in the language of their that they use in their local country. So this is a great addition to the overall domain name system. A little bit of basics here about what is a registry, or what are the players in the domain name space. You know, the registry is the database where domain names are kept. So think of that like the title service. And then if you're an end user or a registrant, you go to a registrar, which is in a sense something like a storefront that enables you to select the name that you want. In the ICANN context, these relationships are managed by different contracts. And so we have contracts with all of the generic top-level domain registries. So that's everything from .com and .net, and the newer top-level domains such as .paris or .budapest. We also have contracts with the registrars that enable these names to be registered by end users. But these raise particular jurisdictional issues. So depending on if a name has been registered for a malicious purpose, often the law enforcement doesn't know who they need to go to. And in fact, in many cases, they might need to go to a registrar or a reseller first in order to take action against the domain.
So could you give us an example of this? Because this sounds absolutely fascinating. And I'd just love to know what this process looks. So essentially if, for example, a domain is used for malicious purpose, then you can't do it centrally. You can't do anything about it centrally. You essentially need to go to the jurisdiction of the registrar where the domain is registered. Did I understand correctly?
Well, I put this here so that you know that when law enforcement or a trademark owner is trying to go after or interact with the party closest to where the harm is occurring, they should go to either the registrar first, and the registrar may need assistance from the registry. In the next section, I'll talk about DNS security issues and go into this in a bit more detail. Yeah, okay. So I just want to give some background into what are the names, who are the parties, how do these parties interact with both ICANN, and how they operate. So that sets the stage for the other discussion about security issues. Now, this is a good transition because now we're heading into this section. Within ICANN's role, we refer to some terms, and when we're talking about security within ICANN's role, we're talking about it's the capacity to protect and prevent misuse of the unique identifiers themselves. Stability, we refer to that as the ability of the system overall to operate as users expect, and that the users have the confidence that the system operates in the way that they expect it to. And resiliency is the capacity of the system as a whole to withstand and tolerate and survive these different disruption and events that may occur, so that internet service is maintained for the users and for the companies that rely on this structure. Now, often you may hear this term DNS abuse. This is an active topic of discussion in our work right now. DNS abuse refers to anything that's attacking or abusing the infrastructure itself. Misuse refers to exploiting the protocols or the registration processes so that names can be used for some type of malicious purpose. And I'll go into some examples of how some of these names have been misused quite recently around the COVID-19 pandemic. Why is this important? Why is the DNS commonly attacked? Well, everyone globally is using this domain name system, whether they realize it or not, to resolve names to machines to access the content that they want. And if criminal organizations or groups can disrupt this, they can disrupt government services, social networks, they can extract information from companies and prevent merchant transactions, redirect users who might be looking for trying to access their banks, airlines, or other services. And if you can exploit the domain name system, you can trick and defraud and deceive users. Now, often this occurs through the malicious registration of domain names or of hijacking of name resolution or registration services. So a good example of things that have happened in the last year, a number of registrars had their interfaces compromised, and so that these groups were able to change the name servers for users where they thought they might have been going to their bank. They were actually going to the criminal organization's website and then submitting their own privacy information and allowing these criminals to get access to their information. If criminals can corrupt domain name system data, they can also make changes to the zone files. That's the information that's in the registry database. And this happened with the Greek country code and the Armenian country code and a number of registries in both the Middle East, Gulf, and also in Europe. Now, some commonly recognized terms when we're talking about phishing, that's the process the practice of sending emails that are pretending to be from companies that users are very comfortable with interacting and tricking those individuals to reveal some type of personal information, such as their passwords, credit card numbers, and other information that then these criminals can use to extract information out. Malware is a type of software that's designed to either damage or disrupt or sometimes gain unauthorized access to a computer system. So this has been in the news quite a lot in the past year. A number of hospital networks and companies such as Travelex, which provides a lot of currency exchange for at airports and banks around the world. Their networks were hit with this type of malware, and it completely shut down their websites. Often these criminal groups try to trick the companies or users to pay a ransom in order to have their systems unlocked. And in most cases, the organizations that have had this happen to them don't get their data back. And the criminals can often take away large sums of money from the companies that have had this happen to them. The third example are botnets. And so this is a network of computers that are linked together through either a malicious software or code, and they're controlled as a group. And often these are managed through what we call domain generation algorithms. It's these names that are randomly generated that connect the botnets to the machines that then are then used for either denial of service attacks or some type of other malicious purpose. And then what's our role in this? So when there are large scale attacks, these tend to involve governments, companies that are spread out across the world, international law enforcement, and significant news coverage. We provide a very a limited but a coordinated and facilitating role. So we work together with registries, registrars, law enforcement to share information, our experiences, and also to connect different parties together. In many cases, when these types of attacks happen, law enforcement doesn't have the direct contacts that we have at ICANN. And so they'll come and ask how can they get in touch with a particular registry or registrar, and we're able to connect them.
How does this work from a jurisdictional issue, right?
Yeah.
So let's say that there is, so you are based in the US, so you fall under American law, I'm guessing, right?
So ICANN is based in the United States, but we also have locations in other places around the world.
So if, for example, let's say like DNS abuse or malware attacks happen in other countries, then essentially, how does this work across jurisdictions? Like, if, for example, there's a DNS attack that, let's say, hits out at American users, but users in one of the jurisdictions in which you are based, does the local police from those countries contact you? Do you usually get in touch with just law enforcement in the States? How does this work jurisdictionally?
Yeah, so often either the law enforcement or multinational law enforcement groups such as Interpol or Europol will contact our Office of the CTO security team, and those parties will work together to share information, and regularly we'll connect them with the appropriate registry or registrar so that that entity can take action against whatever the law enforcement is asking about.
Cool, cool. So I was just super curious, and I thought that a lot of people had this because I know that with the internet, jurisdictional issues can get incredibly messy from what I've heard.
Yeah, I think as I go into the discussion of the current issues around security and COVID-19, that will probably highlight some of these, the cross-border collaboration that we've been doing. And this is a very active and interesting topic right now.
Yeah, definitely. Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. So what are we seeing? At any time there is a major global event, whether it is a natural disaster or a sporting event, particularly when there's a holiday period, these are attractive events for criminal organizations to try to take advantage of others. Often they'll register large blocks of domain names, or they'll create pages that look like pages that users might be going to either provide donations or to look up just factual information of what's happening with these different events. Now, they often use this as a lure to either do some type of malware distribution. They'll do ransomware, which is, as I've described earlier, it's to infect machines in order to extract some type of payment. Often they're doing some type of theft of personal identifying information, or things that fall into the general category of fraud and scams. Now, this is an example of a guidance that was released by Europol in late March, warning people that they can't find, they're not going to be able to find a cure for COVID-19 online. That beware that there are thousands of websites that are claiming to sell different cures or tests or vaccines, and these are all fake. And to be cautious and careful of the things that people see and read about online. That's just one example of the type of guidance that has been published. Another type of threat that has happened, so this map, it was a quite popular map produced by Johns Hopkins University that was tracking the spread of the coronavirus in the early stages of the pandemic. And the criminal groups were able to take the snapshot that was of the feed coming from Johns Hopkins University and create a page that looked like the official page. And so people were infecting their machines through this malware. And so this is just one example of criminal groups trying to take advantage of users looking for factual information about the pandemic. Now, around the same time in March, in the United States, our Federal Trade Commission issued this warning that different criminal groups are trying to take advantage of users, and to be aware that don't fall for these types of scams, that people might be claiming to sell products that either offer testing or masks or other things that aren't authorized. Our Federal Bureau of Investigation also noticed that there were an increase in these fraud schemes, either pretending to be from Centers of Disease Control, phishing email that was pretending to be from the World Health Organization or other charitable institutions such as the Red Cross. They were also trying to trick people into thinking that they were getting airline refunds. So you can see just the breadth of the type of criminal activity that's been happening around the pandemic. And so this guidance out to the wider community is to use good cyber hygiene, be aware that these types of attacks are happening and that it is quite widespread. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this type of, the current pandemic is creating a pool of victims. As we're all working from home, sheltering in place, we're relying on the internet to get the information that we need, to do shopping in many cases. And so there are groups that are trying to take advantage of this, and they're just, this is just one type of criminal activity that's happened. But as they move in mass to using COVID-19 or coronavirus or cures, other search terms, they're using these as their hook to go after users. Now, what are some of the things that our security team has been seeing in the wider environment is that they're seeing these scams that are offering to sell masks. They're seeing either threats of claiming that if you don't pay the ransom, I could infect you or your whole family with coronavirus. And you can see these types of things that are happening out there. Our security team has been following this closely, and they've constructed this system that looks at the domain names that are being registered each day against search terms like corona, COVID-19, pandemic, and other terms. Now this data is from a couple weeks ago. They had seen almost 100,000 domain names that have been registered. The data is a little off, but the daily number trend tends to be, is starting to go down. In any case, our team runs these names through a process, and then out of that process, it boils it down to about 50 to 100 names per day that then that are associated with either some type of phishing or malware. And they'll take those names to our contracted parties, to our registries and registrars, and work with them to prevent them from appearing in the domain name system. So we're trying to remove these COVID-19 domains out of use. There's quite a lot of collaborative work that's underway, and we are seeing good joint effort from the registries and registrars and law enforcement in taking action against these domain names. There are some community efforts that have sprung up around this. And so this screenshot is from the end of March. This was a COVID-19 cyber threat coalition. It's a volunteer effort. There are several thousand security researchers and law enforcement that have joined this threat coalition. And they've been producing weekly blogs about the types of threats that they see. It's open for anyone that's interested, and you can go to cyberthreatcoalition.org for more information. Some other examples of actions that have been taken at the country code level. So Nominet runs .uk and a number of other top-level domains. They've introduced these landing pages. So names that get suspended for some type of activity. If you land on one of these pages, you'll see this domain suspended landing page, and that shows that these registries are trying to remove these names from being abusing users. Another example of guidance that has been introduced. So the Dutch registry published this article, or they republished this from mid-March, that there were fake websites being developed and spoofing of major publications, and so to be aware that type of activity was happening. As we move into the development of tools that might either introduce contact tracing or exposure tracking, so Google and Apple that manage some of the largest application platforms have been cracking down on these types of malicious applications that might be spreading misinformation or not working up to acceptable standards. And so this is an example just from the beginning of March. A lot of this work is happening quite rapidly, and so things are being updated all the time about what's acceptable in these type of application platforms. A number of governments are trying to come up with and examine exposure tracing or contact tracing applications. But the challenge is that many of these applications are being developed so quickly that they are potentially exposing the user data for those who are so this is an example of just from 2 weeks ago, there was a data breach in the source code of a proposed app for contact tracing. And we'll likely see these types of things continue to happen as these applications are being developed. We've put together some tools and some information that it's worth following if you are interested in more. So ICANN has published 2 recent blogs, and those are provided the links at the bottom. The Registrar community has developed this DNS Abuse Framework. And we also have a page on how to report abuse. So these are all links that you can follow to provide some more information about the work that's happening in this area. Now, I'll pause here, but I do have another section that gives some background about domain name system privacy. And so that is related to this, the current work that's happening in response to the COVID-19 domains. But if you want to pause here, maybe see if there's some questions, because we're midway through.
Perfect. No, there are a couple of questions actually. So there's actually 2 of them. So one of them asks that, can you recommend any sort of good software, websites, databases, or practices that recognize URLs as fake? Like, I remember that most web browsers now actually have like a list of phishing sites, and I think that Google also informs you about it, right? But are there some more steps that we should take?
Yeah, so most of the browsers will have something in their in the URL or their browser bar that will warn you. Some of the guidance that ICANN has been trying to promote is that if you're using what we call domain name security extensions, that'll give a warning to users that they may be going to a domain that is not the authenticated site. And so we're trying to promote the adoption of we call DNSSEC, domain name security extensions. And the more registries and registrars and internet service providers that are doing validation will make it easier to tell that a domain is an official one that you're looking for, and that will help prevent these man-in-the-middle types of attacks.
Cool. Maybe another very quick question that I was actually having, because I love that you talked about the internationalization of domain names. And one of the things that we've seen some time ago is that, of course, domain names are now in lots of different languages. along this with lots of different scripts, which means that it's, for example, quite easy to confuse a potential user by mixing up different elements in different scripts. So I don't know, like the Latin P and the Cyrillic R look pretty much the same, which essentially means that you could, for example, have a website where the link is in Cyrillic, but only in Cyrillic letters that have equivalents in the Latin alphabet, that looks very, very similar to a legitimate link, let's say in the Latin alphabet or vice versa. And it's next to impossible to tell it apart. So like, I think that the internationalization of domain names is incredible. It's beautiful. It's very, very necessary. But I'm just very curious as to how you've managed to look at and mitigate some of the security risks associated with that as well.
Yeah, so that's definitely a growing attack trend that we're seeing, is that a number of international domain name registrations look like well-known brands. And particularly if you're a user and you're on your smartphone and you might, what we call fat finger a link, you wouldn't fall for one of those, or you may be more cautious if you're looking at that link on your laptop. But if you're on your phone and you act quickly, you could redirect yourself to a attacker's page and fall for what would be a phishing domain. And so we've tried to work with our registries and registrars and raise awareness that this is a new attack vector, and that well-known brands are seeing the impersonation of their pages through internationalized domains.
And also, I know that like a lot of big brands, they are also getting, this is super interesting. And I think that one of the things that's also happening is that the big brands are not just having .com domain names. Like Google has the .google domain level extensions. I think it's like you get now docs.google rather than docs.google.com and the like. Are companies also essentially buying up their own extensions as a way of maintaining security and reducing phishing attacks? Is that mostly a brand building thing? And if they are doing it for security, do you sort of fear that we have a world in which like the best resourced companies will have the ability to sort of get over all of the domain security issues by buying their own top level domains, whereas companies with lower resources will not be able to do this?
That's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, we did see so ICANN supported recently a round for not just companies, but governments, cities, and other locations to apply for new top-level extensions. And we're seeing quite a number of those being used. Some of them are brands, but others are spaces for cultural and linguistic domains. So there's .eus for the Basque community, or .paris for the city of Paris. But there are some companies that registered these or applied for these extensions for the purpose of providing more security for their corporate networks. So an example is KPMG, which is a large consultancy, switched away from kpmg.com to .kpmg. And they said that they did this to increase the security of their systems, and also to provide for themselves more control over the maintenance of that space. And we may see more companies and organizations interested in that. There's not a current round open for those companies that didn't apply back in 2013, but perhaps at some point that'll be an option. And as you say, that creates a challenge for those that are less resourced, that might not be able to apply for these types of extensions, but they're still able to use second level names and secure those through common protocols. So there's quite a lot of security improvements that can do in a .gr or .pl or in a .net name.
Perfect. We are actually getting lots of other questions, including about .org, which we'd love to talk about at the end, but maybe it's time to quickly jump to DNS privacy, and then I'd love to have a bit more of a discussion at the end, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is give a little bit of history of where we have come from the last 8-9 years, and how it set up some of the newer encryption protocols that are being used. I don't have a lot on this, but it is a current and developing topic, and it's probably something of interest to the users who have tuned into the talk. So if you think back to 2013, it's not all that long ago that we had the revelations of the global surveillance that was started with not just the National Security Agency in the United States, but other state security entities. And from the Snowden revelations, quite a lot has changed. Indirectly, these revelations have led to the creation of the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union and in other countries. Similar data protection laws have been introduced. So not just from the legal changes that have occurred, but there have been some technical changes too. In May of 2014, this document was published at the Internet Engineering Task Force. And so this was the technical community's response to the revelations of mass surveillance. And the document is titled "Pervasive Monitoring is an Attack." And it went into describing how this type of mass surveillance was attack on the internet and the technical system. Out of this document, there was a working group that was established, and that working group created the development of these encryption protocols called DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS. Now, it hasn't been that long. So if you think about, Snowden revelations came out, then this document was published in May of 2014. These new protocols were created in 2016 and 2018. At the same time of these protocols, you see, so this is a historic photo from 2014 of, this is taken from Turkey, and at the time in Turkey, Twitter was being censored. And so the protesters there had spray painted, 8.8.8.8 or 8.8.4.4. And so what they were doing was encouraging users to switch to Google Public DNS so they could route around the blocking of Twitter and other tools within Turkey. Now, Google Public DNS had been around since 2010, but it didn't really take off as a popular public DNS platform until around this 2014 timeframe. And now there are other competitors to Google's public DNS. There's Cloudflare has their 1.1.1.1. There's Quad9 has the same 9.9.9.9, and there's other tools that are out there. Now, depending on where you sit in the spectrum, your privacy concerns are going to be different. So if you're an end user, you're concerned about having secure browsing so that you can reach the pages that you intend to reach in a secure manner. If you're an internet service provider, your interest is in managing the DNS resolution for your customers, and you might be required, based on local law, to do some type of monitoring or, in some cases, censorship of what users are trying to access. If you're a company, or an organization, whether you're running a corporate network or a university network or some type of other enterprise network, you want to protect both your corporate assets, information, and your employees, but you also might impose some type of virtual private network or some type of control on the devices that have access to that corporate network. And you want to prevent your internal information from leaking out to either for criminal organizations to extract secrets or personal information from your employees. If you're a browser, whether you're one of the large browsers or you're managing an interface on behalf of the users to get the information that they need. And so each one of these entities is going to have different concerns about privacy. Now, this is an example of some research that was published last year that showed that 1 in 4 Google public DNS queries were being intercepted. And this is from mid-July, and so likely that is a trend that is increasing, where there are internet service providers that are experiencing this type of interception of data. So this is a visualization of a user trying to access YouTube in China, and we're having their traffic intercepted. At the time this was published, about 30% of the traffic to YouTube was being intercepted in this way through Google Public DNS. Now, that leads us to the technical community responses to these privacy issues. I won't spend a lot of time in detail. You could have a whole talk about these two protocols. But in short, DNS over TLS, it was introduced in 2016, and DNS over HTTPS, which encrypts the traffic so it looks like ordinary web traffic, has only been around for about 2 years. They both try to improve privacy through encryption in slightly different ways. And we don't have a lot of time to go into detail, but if you're interested in this, I'd point you to 2 documents. One is from our Security and Stability Advisory Committee, and the link is at the bottom. And another is a document that was published by our Office of the CTO team in February, and it talks about the local and internet policy implications of encryption. They're both intended to be factual, neutral documents, and I think both of these documents set out a good overview of the debate around encryption at these different entities. And this should give us enough time questions at the end, but if you're interested in all these security topics, you can follow the work at ICANN Meetings. Right, we've been making our meetings virtual, so we do these sessions 3 times a year. We're coming up on a virtual meeting for the Kuala Lumpur time zone coming up in June. And we also do a number of webinars and briefings. Just last week, our Office of the CTO team did a briefing about COVID-19 domain abuse. And we're doing more and more of these types of trainings and webinars. So if you're interested, follow our work in one of these areas. And apologies for the grass cutting noise, if you can hear that behind me.
I actually can't hear any grass cutting noise at all. If anything, there's probably more noise coming here, so don't worry about it. Okay.
So we're at question time.
Actually, I would love to, could you maybe jump back the 2 slides to the DNS over HTTP? Yes, I was just curious. So when you said that DNS over HTTPS improves your privacy, does this mean that like my internet service provider or network owner can no longer see what queries I'm making over over DNS or not? Does this, for example, mean that like my internet service provider or my mobile phone company or whoever no longer knows which websites I'm requesting over HTTPS? Like, does it give me a lot of anonymity or what?
So it could, but if your internet service provider or your mobile provider is also running their own DNS over HTTPS server, they'll still get the traffic and the queries that you're using. So it depends on what level, which encryption server you're using. So I would point you to those papers that describe how it works, but it does, for most users, provide more encryption. But in response, internet service providers are also trying to still have some insight into traffic. And they do this to protect their own networks, but they also do this because in some jurisdictions, they're required to do so.
But so this is also one of the reasons why people, for example, use the 8.8.8 as the DNS, so the Google DNS, or the 1.1.1.1.1.1, the Cloudflare DNS, because this essentially means that your telecom or internet service provider will know even less about you, and instead you essentially outsourcing this decision, and you're outsourcing the trust and risk model to Google or Cloudflare, yes?
Yeah, that's one of the issues, is this, it does introduce some particular potential centralization of the traffic. So the papers that have been published both from our security committee and from our Office of the CTO team describe this as one of the factors that you have to weigh, is that sometimes that this may introduce more centralization. So it's one of the issues, but on the other side is it's providing control for users over their encryption, whereas before the traffic was completely unencrypted and anyone along the way could see what domains you're looking up.
Yeah, totally. Actually, we've got a couple more questions from the audience right now. I've just been monitoring the chat. One of them is from a user who's trying to break a bit more into the information security space. And it's been asking what some steps are, whether or not you'd recommend getting certifications, or whether you have any other recommendations on how to best break into the information security space. And the other comment, as I'm sure you've been hearing on a lot of those public events, we'd love to hear some of your comments on the recent .org, essentially what's been happening with regards to .org and how the sale was overruled by the ICANN board, if you've got any insights on that.
Yeah, so I'll take the first question. If you're interested in getting into the information security space, there's a number of websites that you can go to get some either an overview or a introduction into this on the different types of certifications that are available. ICANN is a member of the Forum for Incident Response Security Teams, and so that's first.org. And I think that first, a number of information security entities around the world are members of FIRST, and they have information about how to get certified. ICANN doesn't do certification, but we do have this platform called ICANN Learn, and it has a number of introductory courses. One of them is on basics of cybersecurity. And so you could look at those courses or courses like it to get information about how to learn more about certification. So as for .org, it was in the news quite recently in the last week. ICANN board took a decision to not approve the change of control request. I can't say much more than what was in that announcement. It wasn't approved, and the latest that I've seen is that the Internet Society and the Public Interest Registry, have announced that those entities are not for sale. So we'll see what happens next.
So what's the relationship between ICANN and the Public Interest Registry?
Yeah, so Public Interest Registry is the contracted party that runs not only .org, but a number of top-level domains. They have .ngo and .ong and some other internationalized versions of .org. They're a contracted party of ours, and based on the contracts, they have certain things that they have to follow to run the .org registry in those top-level domains.
Okay, perfect, thanks. And maybe just a couple of issues regarding both, the jurisdiction and the responsibilities of governments. Because first of all, to what extent do you think that managing a lot of the security-related stuff and maybe the privacy issues, to what extent would you like to see it be the purview of governments? And to what degree would you like to see it being done by ICANN, technological organizations, corporations? Because from what I understand, the internet has a very messy governance model known as the multi-stakeholder model. And it feels like kind of everybody has a say in it. So do you think that governments should be having a bigger say in the way the internet is run? Do you think they should be having the say they are now? How does it, especially these jurisdictional issues, kind of get really, really complicated?
Yeah. So one of the beauties of this domain name system is that it wasn't developed by governments. It was, and it relies on, private entities around the world so that it functions correctly. And there aren't that many, and I can't think of another globally used resource that has this type of collaboration element between governments and private industry and individuals and trademark owners and others, lawyers, working collaboratively together to ensure that it works as it should. So, in this age when you've got different jurisdictions, you have this globally used system that impacts users around the world. You can't just have one entity, in governments or businesses, working on their own for it to function correctly. It does rely on this collaborative effort from parties around the world for it to function as it does.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. I love the system and I love learning about it. It's also so multi-layered and so complex. And it's incredible how much of this, say, NGOs, governments, technological groups, and everybody really has in sort of internet governance in general. If I remember correctly, ICANN also does some summits, which a lot of us could apply to as well, right?
Yeah, we have, our events are free and open to attend. Our most recent event was in March. It was supposed to be in Cancun, Mexico. The next one in Europe is currently scheduled for Hamburg, Germany in October. But as we've seen with the response to the pandemic, many of our events are shifting to online. Our next event will be a virtual ICANN meeting at the end of June. I believe it will be set to the Kuala Lumpur time zone, but we'll have a number of sessions that anyone can access through our website and follow the sessions on remotely through Zoom. And we'll have more than enough capacity for participants around the world to follow along. It should be quite lively and interesting discussions on some of the topics I've touched on today. DNS abuse will continue to be a hot topic for these virtual sessions.
Perfect. So if we want to pop by and learn more about internet governance, ICANN, DNS abuse, and all those issues, all we need to do is follow you on one of the social media pages that you've so beautifully listed on the slide, and we can just find the dates of the meetings, register, attend, maybe ask questions, and learn a lot more, yes?
Yeah, I mean, what's great is these are free to attend. Mm-hmm. And so there's no cost for joining these sessions. And they're offered in multiple languages. And so if your first language is not in English, there'll be sessions that are in one of 6 UN languages. And that should help the global community follow our work.
Perfect. I see that there are no more questions on the chat. I think that's been incredibly comprehensive, Patrick. If someone has some last minute questions, please point them right now. Nope, I'm afraid not. So listen, thanks so much for this introduction. Like, I'm going to go and definitely read up so much more about DNS over HTTPS and a lot of other things, because I remember that I was reading about some controversies with ISPs. I don't remember if it was like in the UK or somewhere else. And there have been some big debates over DNS over HTTPS. So I'm definitely going to be reading about it and exploring it much more. So thank you so much for this briefing. Thank you for spending the American morning, European afternoon with us. And we'll definitely be following and checking it out on social media as well. You are also on Twitter, right?
Yes.
So what's your handle if we'd like to follow you?
It's at PLJones96.
Okay, at PLJones96. Perfect. Thanks so much. And Nikos, I'll give you the floor because you look like you definitely want to close this as well. And thank you so much.
No, I don't want to say thank you to you, Lucas, that you moderated the webinar. Patrick, thank you very much for sharing actually your thoughts, your approach, and also giving us all these valuable comments. And I would like also to thank all the participants for being here with us, as well as Digital Communication Network, World Learning, and the Office of Citizens Exchange of State Department that are contributing in this effort in order to realize. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we're having some thank you comments in the chat as well. As I said, we've been following this on social media as well. We've been live streaming it to Facebook Live, YouTube, and the like. So if you want to know any details, like the recordings will be available, as will be the recordings of the slides and sort of the ICANN following links. So thanks so much once again, and have a wonderful morning and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
All right. Bye.